On this edition of the program, the regimes, they are changing. The U.S. takes a good hard look at Venezuela and decides to put Maduro on a boat from there to a courthouse where he will face justice from a brand new indictment. Welcome to New York, Nicholas. It's been waiting for you. Is it the same old song of nation building or a brand new day in Latin America? We break it all down with commentary from our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. It is all coming up.
The following is brought to you by Just Another Pilot.
Welcome, everybody, to the Politics program for January 5th, 2026. Joining you from Austin, Texas. This one's going to go out for everybody. Big story. We got to do it. But just so you know, if you're listening to this and you're not a subscriber, you get this kind of episode every week when there's not gigantic news. But as we all understand, when there's gigantic news, I want to get it out because it is a big thing. You know, we just did our last episode on the free feed was our year in review with Kevin Ryan. And it is good to know what I'll be talking about in 12 months. Took us 3 days into the new year to get January's top story. If anything supersedes this, boy, we are in for some news. But Nicolas Maduro, as we speak, in the city that never sleeps. I don't know if he's sharing a facility with Luigi Mangione, Sam Bankman-Fried, and Diddy, but he is in custody. He is not at the Miraflores Army base in Caracas, Venezuela. That is because the U.S. decided to take him on out this Saturday morning. A 2-hour and 34-minute stem to stern operation where U.S. forces got through whatever was available to defend the alleged president of the of Venezuela. We will get into that legitimacy in a second, but you would imagine that he has about as much protection as anybody was going to have. It didn't seem to take long. Raises a few questions there, but he's gone now. That dude is in the wind, and with it, a lot of questions. Where do we go from here in Venezuela? How did this come to be? How legal is it? This episode is going to have a lot of conversation about all of those, including on-the-record commentary from Marco Rubio, who was on not one but two Sunday shows this morning. We're going to bring you those clips directly, as well as some chattering class. We wanted to keep the chattering class stuff to a minimum on this episode, mostly because, especially this early on, unless it's a very novel statement or argument, I didn't want to include it because there's a lot of noise here, and I want to give you guys as nutritious of an episode as possible. And we're going to start with this. This is the justification for why the United States military aided the Federal Bureau of Investigations to arrest and exfiltrate the head of state, legitimate or otherwise, of a Latin American country. Here are the charges against Nicolas Maduro. Count 1, narco-terrorism conspiracy. This is from 1999 to 2025. Prosecutors allege that Maduro trafficked massive quantities of cocaine, knowing proceeds would support designated terrorist organizations, including FARC, ELN, the Sinaloa Cartel, Zetas, Tren de Aragua, and more. He used state power, military, intelligence, and diplomatic cover to protect trafficking routes. Count 2, cocaine importation conspiracy. The indictment alleges thousands of tons of cocaine conspired to manufacture, distribute, and import cocaine into the United States. Approved and protected air, sea, and land shipments used Venezuelan airports, military aircraft, PDVSA planes, and clandestine airstrips, all knowing that the drugs were destined for the United States. Count 3, possession of machine guns and destructive devices. He used or aided the machine guns and destructive devices, including grenades and launchers, in relation to drug trafficking crimes, as well as supplying and coordinating them to terrorist and cartel partners. Count 4, conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. Those last two are, tack them on. The big thing is the sale and facilitation of cocaine into the United States. If convicted, the U.S. seeks forfeiture of all proceeds of the drug conspiracies, all property used to facilitate the crimes, firearms and ammunition, and substitute assets, if proceeds are hidden, transferred offshore. So, one thing that you don't see in this indictment is fentanyl. And that is an interesting situation because, the reason why we were shooting missiles at boats, theoretically, was because of the fentanyl trade. Now, many people, including yours truly, has told you that if you were to say that Venezuela is involved in the fentanyl trade, you would be doing it as a second knock-on effect actor. Like that it helps cartels that do put fentanyl into the United States. The boats that we probably blew up, that we did blow up, those were almost assuredly being used to police and traffic cocaine, largely going into Europe, also going into the United States, but largely going into Europe. The reason why we were doing it is, as we now know through various different reporting channels, is there has been a squeeze on Maduro for months. Everything that's been done has been to take an already precarious situation. And let me make no mistake here. Venezuela had become a vassal state to China, Cuba, and the cartels. When I say vassal state, this is what I mean. They were not, despite the fact that they are a tremendously oil-rich country, they have been producing under 20% of their capacity and then selling it under market value, largely to either pay Chinese loans, send to Cuba so they could have intelligence services because they could not afford to pay for their own, or making whatever money they could by being in league with the cartels, much of which being skimmed off the top by some of the people that are still in charge of the country today. But Maduro, obviously, first among equals. So if the United States is to harass the already limited way that they can make money, the idea was thought that rats would eventually turn on each other. If the U.S. wants Maduro to step down, maybe Maduro is able to go to Qatar, maybe he's able to go to Turkey, maybe he's able to go to Colombia, something like that. There would be some scenario where he would be able to leave. The Miami Herald wrote a story about this in October. And that Marco Rubio had said, no, look, either we essentially totally reform that country or it's not worth poking around in there. According to the Miami Herald, Marco Rubio was the one who initially talked Trump out of going in his first term, saying that any kind of military action would require more more force in the region. And what we saw over the weekend was a stunning display of power. I don't think anybody, even people who are mad about it, you can't say anything other than that. Again, from the moment that we hit their airspace, it was 2.5 hours before the U.S. had the most protected man in the country with a military protecting him in their custody. Reporting was that it took under 2 minutes for him to surrender. My gut feeling is I don't think you can do that without people on the inside agreeing. The person who is running the country now, there's going to be some conversation about that from some of the talking heads, and Marco Rubio is a true soldier to the Chavez regime, to the Maduro regime. She has already come out and said that Maduro is the true president of Venezuela, blah, blah, blah. I believe that those folks gave Maduro up. I think that military probably stood down more than it would have otherwise, but that's just my own conspiracy. Okay. Let's go ahead and get into the clips. All that, but first.
So is the United States running Venezuela right now?
Well, I've explained once again, I'll do it one more time. What we are running is the direction that this is going to move moving forward. And that is, we have leverage. This leverage we are using and we intend to use. We started using already. You can see where they are running out of storage capacity. In a few weeks, they're going to have to start pumping oil unless they make changes. And that leverage that we have with the armada of boats that are currently positioned allow us to seize any sanctioned boats coming into or out of Venezuela, loaded with oil or on its way in to pick up oil, and we can pick and choose which ones we go after. We have court orders for each one. That will continue to be in place until the people who have control over the levers of power in that country make changes that are not just in the interest of the people of Venezuela, but are in the interest of the United States and the things that we care about. That's what we intend to do. The legal authority is the court orders that we have.
When the president was asked yesterday who will be running Venezuela, he said it was you, he said it was the defense secretary, he said it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Are you running Venezuela right now?
George, I've explained again that the leverage that we have here is the leverage of the quarantine. So that is a Department of War operation, conducting, in some cases, law enforcement functions with the Coast Guard on the seizure of these boats. I'm obviously very intricately involved in these policies. And by the way, very intricately involved in moving forward and what we hope to see some of these changes being addressed. Unfortunately, the person that was there before, who was not the legitimate president of the country, was someone we could not work with, was someone that we could not. He had already suckered the Biden administration a couple of years ago on a deal he didn't keep. And this is someone we simply couldn't work with. We are hopeful that there are people in place now. We're going to find out. The proof will be in what they do or fail to do, that will start making some of these changes that will ultimately lead to a Venezuela that looks substantially and dramatically different from what's been in place for 15 years. But my number one objective is America.
So the big moment during the press conference yesterday, as I am recording this Saturday, if you were listening to this on Monday, was Donald Trump saying that we, the United States of America, are running Venezuela. And he said operationally, that's going to mean Marco Rubio. It's going to mean Pete Hegseth. It's going to mean Dan Kane. And we have heard rumors that people like Doug Burgum may well be involved as well because he's the energy guy. And there's going to be a lot of Western American energy companies that are going to be involved in this. So Rubio, it is interesting to know what he pushes back on and what he doesn't, what he tries to avoid, because there's a lot of dancing by Secretary Rubio here. He says, look, we are not running the country. We do not have an American in their head of state office. There is somebody that we are talking to, but they are going to do what we say because they don't have a choice. They cannot make money. There is no money for them because we control the shipping lines. We control what comes in and out. And we will tell them what they will do. And if they don't, then we will have another conversation. But right now, there seems to be some kind of simpatico on what's going to happen and when. Who is the person? Well, her name is Delcy Rodriguez, and Marco Rubio had a question about her. Does he believe that she is now the legitimate president of Venezuela?
Is it your position now that the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, is now the legitimate president of Venezuela?
Well, this is not about the legitimate president. We don't believe that this regime in place is legitimate via an election, and that's not just us. It's 60-something countries around the world that have taken that view as well, including the European Union. But we understand that there are people in Venezuela today who are the ones that can actually make changes. So, for example, when we want to send in the migrant flights, even though we never recognized the Maduro regime as legitimate, we had to deal with the authorities that controlled the airport. We had to deal with the people who had guns and the people who had control of the airports. We had to deal with them to achieve these objectives. That's different from recognizing their legitimacy. Ultimately, legitimacy for their system of government will come about through a period of transition and real elections, which they have not had. And by the way, it's the reason why Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He's illegitimate president. He was not the head of state. And I continue to see these media reports referring to him as President Maduro and the head of state. He was not the head of state. He was not the head. And it's not just us saying it. The Biden administration said it. And so did 60-something countries around the world hold that position.
The president said that you spoke with the Vice President Rodriguez and that she promised to do whatever the United States needs. But in her televised statement, she was pretty defiant, saying that Maduro is still president and that the Venezuelan people will no longer be slaves or the colony of an empire. That's a quote. What exactly did she say to you, and what comes next?
Well, we're not going to judge moving forward based simply on what's said in press conferences. We want to see action here at the end of the day. Rhetoric is one thing. You see rhetoric for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of different reasons why people go on TV and say certain things in these countries, especially 15 hours or 12 hours after the person who used to be in charge of the regime is now in handcuffs and on his way to New York.
So there's been a lot of conversation. Is now we are all becoming Venezuelan political experts. Political. There's been a lot of conversation about, and I'm going to have to I'm looking at notes here so I don't screw up these names here. Maria Corina Machado, she won the Nobel Peace Prize recently. There is also a man by the name of Edmundo Gonzalez, both of whom have won elections against Maduro. Maduro essentially just canceled them. Said, yeah, psych. By the way, I won. The question then becomes, are either of them looked at as the rightful leader of Venezuela? If we name them that, it would not be the first time that we name somebody who is not the president of Venezuela as the president of Venezuela. The thought would be that if you named them now, essentially you'd fly them in on an airport or an Air Force plane or an Army plane. You land, you swear them in on by whatever means that Venezuela swears in their leader, and then bam, now we recognize them. But we didn't do that. We essentially left Maduro's government in and said, do what we say. Why? So I don't know, and I think anybody who tells you that they know are lying unless they are very, very, very plugged in. But in reading around some of the articles, there's a great article by Mark Caputo in Axios that's essentially Rubio World's a view of this. And their view of this is one of the ways that we really screwed up in Iraq was the de-Baathification of the government. The Ba'ath Party was Saddam Hussein's party. And essentially we ran all those people out immediately. That left a power vacuum that made it harder for civil services to run. And so if you already have a precarious position, what you don't want is for a new person to come in and immediately have to face essentially a civil war. If something like that is going to happen, you'd rather it be to the Maduro holdovers than you would somebody else who's coming along. And then there's this, and I'm going to read this from Twitter. This is just kind of a guy, right? This is somebody who lists himself as a former journalist in Miami, Francisco Polio. He writes this on Twitter today. For a long period, U.S. officials, including Marco Rubio, were in constant communication with Machado and her team. They were asked repeatedly for proof of a concrete plan, not just to win power symbolically, but to retain it in practice. Chain of command, military alignment, institutional control, day after governance. The answers were consistently evasive, justified by security concerns, but never substantiated. At that point, from the U.S. government's perspective, the opposition ceased to look like a viable transition mechanism and began to look like a political wager with no enforcement. And the reason why is because Maria Corina Machado does not have control of the military, nor could she meaningfully fracture the military in a way for which she could try to reshape it. She has the will of the people. She does not have the will of the people that would keep her in power. And so that's the argument from the administration's perspective. If you were to be critical about it, what you'd say is, awesome, you removed one snake and literally just promoted another snake to head snake. What do you think's going to happen? At some point, it's going to get ugly. You're not going to want the smoke. You're going to leave, and they're going to go back to dealing with the cartels, Iran and China. And the argument from the White House and Trump world is, no, we are going to essentially force them into reform. With the idea being that you essentially open up, at the very least, the economy and the oil fields to the kind of infrastructure repair that they need. And then you're going to force an open election that'll be monitored by international whatevers. But in the meantime, and this is one of those issues where Marco's dancing, he's not going to call Delcy Rodriguez legitimate. In fact, this is one of those things that the Trump administration is just going to violate international norms on. We are not going to name our person that we believe should be running the country. We're going to try to get the country in a shape where we believe that the Venezuelans will be able to pick their own leader. And if that happens to be Machado, then that happens to be Machado. But moving on, I mentioned oil fields. That's a huge question here because Venezuela is a petrostate, always has been. Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, although they are difficult to get to and they produce heavy crude. So, ain't this just all about the oil? Marco.
But how does the United States intend to secure the oil fields? Won't that take U.S. troops?
Well, ultimately, this is not about securing the oil fields. This is about ensuring that no sanctioned oil can come in and out until they make changes to the governance of that entire industry. Because right now, that industry is non-existent in the traditional way. These oil fields basically are pirate operations. People literally steal the oil from the ground. That's how they hold this regime together. A handful of cronies benefit from this oil, specific oil wells. They're producing at like 18% capacity because the equipment is all decrepit, and they basically pocket the money to their benefit. They sell the oil at a discount in global markets, 40 cents on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar, but all that money goes to them. Those oil fields have not benefited the people of Venezuela in over a decade, but they have made multi-millionaires, billionaires, out of just a handful of people, and that's what's held this regime together. That's what needs to be addressed. The way to address it to the benefit of the Venezuelan people is to get private companies that are not from Iran or somewhere else to go in, invest in the equipment that hasn't been invested in 20 years because none of the profits that had been made from the oil has been reinvested. It's all been stolen. And that's going to take outside companies that come in and know how to do that. The people who do this stuff will know how to do it. But it all begins with dramatic changes at the way on the way that the authorities that are in charge of that industry behave. And until those changes happen, this quarantine will remain in place.
Chevron is the only American company working in Venezuela right now, only American oil company working in Venezuela right now. Have you gotten commitments from any other U.S. oil companies to go in?
I haven't spoken to U.S. oil companies in the last few days, but we're pretty certain that there will be dramatic interest from Western companies, non-Russian, non-Chinese companies will be very interested. Our refineries in the Gulf Coast of the United States are the best in terms of refining this heavy crude. And there's actually been a shortage of heavy crude around the world. So I think there will be tremendous demand and interest from private industry if given the space to do it, if given the opportunity to do it. And that will spin off tremendous royalties for the people of Venezuela, to benefit the people of that country, not the handful of people at the top, but the people.
So the oil question is multifold. And here are the most interesting sides of it from my perspective. Number one, the largest importer of Venezuelan oil is China. Is it the number one place that they get oil? No. Is it important to the mix of how they power their country? Yeah, it is. Us taking that away, at the very least, gives us a bargaining chip. And you know that Venezuela mattered to China because the last official state visit that Maduro conducted, well, ni hao. It was with the Chinese. Two, Venezuela at its best, at its most economically exciting and dynamic, was during the spike in oil prices in the aughts under Chavez. Those were the waning days because Chavez essentially took all that money and put it into the country and did not put it into reinvestment or maintenance of the machinery that they needed to get the oil out of the ground. And that proved to be the last days of disco for what they had essentially powered the country on. As soon as all that began to become decrepit, Chavez goes. Maduro is an even dumber version than Chavez by all accounts. And now they are producing a trickle of what they could be, and all of their equipment is busted. So it will require billions of dollars. It will require long-term thinking from a lot of these energy companies if they want to go into Venezuela. But here's the third part. Venezuela also has tremendous oil reserves. Those oil reserves are now allegedly in American control. What does that mean? We don't know. We don't know. But the oil fields, more long-term. The oil export, very pressing, because that seems to be, at least by the administration's language, their leverage point against Delcy Rodriguez, right? Yeah. And then the reserves, that's something where the U.S., if the U.S. wants a quick trillion, I think it's like 13 trillion worth of oil that is just sitting there in Venezuela. U.S. want to just hit a lick for a quick tea. It's out there. Does that sound a little sketchy? Maybe it is. But is any of this legal? Rubio answered that question.
Still not clear on what the legal authority is for the United States to run the country of Venezuela, but several members of Congress and other legal experts have said this operation to take Maduro was illegal because you didn't seek congressional authorization. Why wasn't congressional authorization necessary?
It wasn't necessary because this was not an invasion. We didn't occupy a country. This was an arrest operation. This was a law enforcement operation. He was arrested on the ground in Venezuela by FBI agents, read his rights, and removed from the country. I encourage everyone, I know it's Sunday, people are busy, but the indictments have now been unsealed. People should read this indictment. they should read this indictment. They should read what this man did for the last 15 years of his life against the United States, him and his wife. He was arrested. Obviously, this was not a friendly territory. So in order to arrest him, we had to ask the Department of War to become involved in this operation. The Department of War went in, they hit anything that was a threat to the agents that were going in to arrest him, and they hit anything that was a threat on the way out, and they hit anything that was a threat to them while they were on the ground. And that was a very limited and targeted operation. It is also a trigger-based operation. All kinds of conditions had to be in place. The weather had to be right. He had to be staying in a certain spot. Everything had to be in place for order that to happen. You can't congressionally notify something like this for two reasons. Number one, it will leak. It's as simple as that. And number two, it's an exigent circumstance. It's an emergent thing that you don't even know if you're going to be able to do it. We can't notify them we're going to do it on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday, because at some points we didn't know if we were going to be able to carry this out. We didn't know if all of the things that had to line up were going to line up at the same time in the right conditions. You know, he had to be at the right place at the right time with the right weather and all sorts of things like that. So those are very difficult to notify. But the number one reason is operational security.
We're going to get to a clip about this a little bit later, but you've heard a lot of comps as to what happened. This is like Syria. This is like Iraq. This is like Afghanistan. I don't quite know if any of those examples match one-to-one with what happened on Saturday. To me, the far closer match is what happened in Panama with Manuel Noriega. Now, they do not match exactly, but if you were going to look at a criminal snatching of a head of state in the region for drug stuff, you know, that to me is a closer comp. We're going to hear a Democratic rebuttal to that point of view. But I don't see as much. I mean, maybe it's just me. I don't see as much Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, Afghanistan has no history of democracy like Venezuela had prior to Chavez. I mean, even through the communist regimes, they were, you know, feigning at elections. Iraq at one point was a far more educated place and by and large has kind of held together. You know, Saddam was a brutal strongman dictator, but, you know, since then, Iraq at least hasn't been a gigantic problem in the same way that it was under Saddam. Syria, obviously an absolute, like, crap show, right? For a million different reasons. But if I were just comping it right now out of nowhere, I would say that Panama and Venezuela are closer together than Venezuela is to what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. Furthermore, we didn't grab their heads of state alive under the runtime of Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. We did that in Venezuela. And I do think not factoring in all the resources that went into both Afghanistan and Iraq, if you just take away dropping the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, going after Mullah Omar, the months it took to get into Kabul, blah, 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 or in Iraq, you know, that was shock and awe. That was, you know, moving northward into Baghdad, securing that town. Like there was a lot before Saddam was captured. That part of it is done in 2.5 hours now. So I do think that there are some differences. That's why it feels more like Noriega to me. Now, what happens going forward? That's the larger question. Okay, so all of those clips were from ABC's This Week. These clips are from Face the Nation. Rubio, again, clarifying some of the run the country stuff, but really talking about whether or not we are into boots on the ground territory. Again, the big worry here that we are just getting into another forever war. Will we be putting boots on the ground?
What you are talking about is more of a sanctions pressure, not boots on the ground. So just to be clear, there is no plan for U.S. occupation of this country of nearly 30 million people.
Well, I think, first of all, the president always retains optionality on anything and on all of these matters. He certainly has the ability and the right under the Constitution of the United States to act against imminent and urgent threats against the country. That said, and all of that said, right now, I think what you see as a force posture was one of the largest naval deployments in modern history, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. And it is capable of stopping not just drug boats, but stopping any of these sanctioned boats that come in and out and really paralyzing that portion of how the regime, generates revenue. So that will continue to be in place. What the president has said, obviously, is, and I think what he's pointing to is that this obsession people have about boots and this or that, but he does not feel like he is going to publicly, rule out options that are available for the United States, even though that's not what you're seeing right now. What you're seeing right now is an oil quarantine that allows us to exert tremendous leverage over what happens next.
So I don't immediately think we're going to be fighting guerrilla warfare with the colectivos in the jungles of Venezuela. I don't think that it is in the United States' interest to do that. And we believe that we can get what we want in different ways. I do think that something has changed, and we can now pretty clearly define Donald Trump's foreign policy. When Trump hit Soleimani in Iran, or on a tarmac in Iraq, going back to Iran, but he was the Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani. A lot of questions about whether or not we were involved in World War III never really happened. Sudden decisive action. Again with Iran, knocked out their nuclear facilities. Boom. The only reason why we knew it happened is because Trump truthed about it. And now Maduro on the USS Iwo Jima, about to face charges in New York. That seems to be more how Trump wants to do things. Big catastrophic action with the threat that if you think that's bad, just wait to see what's coming next if you don't straighten up. We've seen in the past with Iran twice, it might just be an Iran thing, that Iran backed down. Nothing really happened. Killed Soleimani. They yelled, they screamed. And by the way, Iran's got bigger problems. We're going to have somebody on this week talking about Iran. I don't think Venezuela has the stroke to come back and do anything. And if they don't, then the question is, okay, well, if we then blockade your oil, either you're going to do it or somebody else is going to do it, if you're talking to Delcy Rodriguez. And yet, we don't support this regime. You heard Marco Rubio say it earlier. So then why did we leave everybody there? A contentious back and forth with Rubio and Margaret Brennan.
He also said the U.S. is ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. But I'm curious because you just described the regime as still in place, essentially. I mean, I'm curious why the Trump administration decided to leave it intact and only arrest Nicolas Maduro and his wife, the person who controls the police, the chief thug, Diaz-Cabello. He's the interior minister. He's been indicted by the United States. He was in that indictment the administration released. He's a narco-terrorist. There's a $25 million price on his head. He's still in place. The defense minister, who has deep ties to Russia, $15 million price on his head. He is still in place. I'm confused. Are they still wanted by the United States? Why didn't you arrest them if you are taking out the narco-terrorist regime?
You're confused? I don't know why that's confusing to you.
They're still in
It's
power.
very simple. You're not going to go in and wrap up. But you can't go. You're going to go in and suck up 5 people. They're already complaining about this one operation. Imagine the howls we would have from everybody else if we actually had to go and stay there 4 days to capture 4 other people. We got the top priority. The number one person on the list was the guy who claimed to be the president of the country that he was not. And he was arrested along with his wife, who was also indicted. And that was a pretty sophisticated and frankly complicated operation.
It was.
It is not easy to land helicopters in the middle of the largest military base in the country. The guy lived on a military base. Land within 3 minutes, kick down his door, grab him, put him in handcuffs, read him his rights, put him in a helicopter, and leave the country without losing any American or any American assets. That's not an easy mission. And you're asking me, why didn't we do that in 5 other places at the same time? I mean, that's absurd. I do think this is one of the most, daring, complicated, sophisticated missions this country has carried out in a very long time. Tremendous credit to the U.S. military personnel who did it. It was unbelievable, and tremendous success. And today, an indicted drug trafficker who was not the legitimate president of Venezuela, who we don't recognize, the Biden administration didn't recognize, 60-something countries don't recognize, the European Union doesn't recognize, and many countries in Latin America don't recognize. He was a indicted drug trafficker. He was arrested. His wife was arrested, also
but the
indicted, and they are now
others who are also
facing justice in
indicted
an
are
American
still
system of courts.
The others who are also indicted are still in place. So that's the point of my questioning there. But you talked about not being the legitimate
So you wanted
president.
us to land in 5 other military bases?
No, I'm asking why you chose that this was the limit of the military operation. But to your point that you just made, that Maduro was not the legitimate president.
He was the guy who was claiming to be the president.
Right. Well, the opposition.
He was the top target.
Man, is it hard to be a Margaret Brennan fan sometimes, because I think, God bless her, but she's a television journalist and they're not real journalists. So like the question she wants to ask is, what are our expectations of people that we clearly don't trust? If you just try to hit him with why didn't you arrest the entire government? Then he can be evasive. If you ask what our expectations are from people that we do not trust, many of which are under federal indictment along with Maduro, well, at least you get what I think is kind of the answer here, which is we will trust them as much as they are to be trusted. And that's, I think, the operating idea here. I don't know why I said idea. Jeez Louise. All right, another back and forth testy with Brennan and Rubio about Edmundo Gonzalez. Rubio gets into a little history lesson here. If you like Marco Rubio yelling at Margaret Brennan, then here's one for you.
Because yesterday, President Trump said Maria Corina Machado doesn't have the support or respect within the country, and by your own admission, she walloped Nicolas Maduro in the last election. So it does sound like a decision was made. But
she wasn't
today
on the ballot in the last election.
No, but her party was.
Edmundo was.
Yes.
Correct.
So
it was an illegitimate election, and that's why he's not a legitimate president.
Right, but is there an agreement to transition to democracy?
I think what the president pointed out is the obvious. Well, I think what the point, but there has to be a little realism here, okay? A transition to they've had this regime, they've had this system of Chavismo in place for 15 or 16 years. And everyone's asking why 24 hours after Nicolas Maduro was arrested, there isn't an election scheduled for tomorrow? That's
no,
absurd.
I'm asking what you talked about with her.
These things take time, there's a process.
Right. And you
well, I'm not going to publicly get into details about any of those things other than to tell you that our expectations remain the same. And we are going to judge whoever we're interacting with moving forward by whether or not those conditions are met. Of course we want to see Venezuela transition to be a place completely different than what it looks like today. But obviously we don't have the expectation that's going to happen in the next 15 hours. What we do have an expectation is that it move in that direction. We think it's in our national interest and frankly in the interest of people of Venezuela.
All right, so that is Marco Rubio. who is the face of this operation. He's the one that's out on TV. This has been a focus for Marco Rubio since he was in local government in Miami. And I'm just going to say, because Rubio said it publicly, Cuba. Cards on the table here. Your humble host, as many of you know, because I talk about it enough, raised in South Florida. South Florida is home to many people from Latin America. But very often what you find is that it is the number one place that people fleeing failing or failed states in Central and South America come. If they got any kind of money, they're like, screw it. If you can get to them, if you can get to the U.S., you're going to get to the U.S. You're going to find some place, and there's a community there for you. Now, I grew up in Broward County. South Florida is essentially 3 counties. Palm Beach County, which has Mar-a-Lago, that is largely either affluent by the beach, and then there is some very poor areas, very poor black areas in Palm Beach. Broward County, which has its own poor black areas. It's also like as country, as southern as South Florida gets, which is around where my neck of the woods was, like Cooper City, Davie. And then the most amount of transplants from New York, New Jersey, and Boston you've ever seen in your entire life. They all live in Broward. Both Palm Beach and Broward, heavily Jewish as well. Miami is Miami. You understand Miami. That's Cuban. That is, the Liberty City area is black. There's some gentrifying areas like Wynwood, where Peter Thiel allegedly is setting up residence so he can avoid a possible California billionaires tax. We'll talk about that some point in the future. But I give you this geography lesson for 2 reasons. First, to tell you that Weston, which is in Broward County, it is right where, I grew up, right next to where I grew up, is nicknamed Westonzuela. Like, it is heavily Venezuelan expats. If there was one place I wanted to be on Saturday night, it was in Westonzuela. I wanted to get on a flight so bad and just party in Weston last night, because I can imagine that had to be insane, had to be lit. Friend of mine lives around that area. He said the flags were out like it was a World Cup game, which is a very uniquely, there are some weird times where you're living in South Florida and you're just like, you're walking down the street, or you're, just outside, and there's people banging pots and pans and screaming and yelling and honking the horn. And you're like, it's like a random Thursday. And then you find out it's some Copa America game and people are freaking out. Anyway, that was the mood. The other reason why I tell you that is I grew up around Latin American dissident communities from the Caribbean, Central, and South America. The biggest, most notable one is Cuba, but the Venezuelans have had a tremendous exodus. In fact, I think that it is only, I've seen this stat said enough that I'm not going to double check it because it sounds directionally correct, that next to Syria, Venezuela was the largest refugee exodus over the last 20 years. And that's just because of a economic change. The government did not collapse. It just changed the way it did things. Hyperinflation ripped through that country. A lack of production ripped through that country. Political dissent was crushed. Bad times. So the people that have left Venezuela are very, very mad about what happened to Venezuela. The heart of those dissident immigrant communities that settled in the area that I grew up in, is something that is core to my thought process when it comes to a lot of these things. Mostly because it was the first time that I ever understood that things were kind of different outside the United States. It's hard to not internalize that when every afternoon in the 90s, when I was growing up and you still had wet foot, dry foot, which is the policy by which Cuban refugees could get immediate refugee status in the U.S. if, like a double dare physical challenge, you could just physically touch the beach. Meaning that the Coast Guard would try to get you right up until you were able to get on land. If you're, and I'm sure there's a YouTube compilation up somewhere, but it was the greatest reality television show I'd ever seen in my entire life. These are people that are on makeshift flotillas because it's illegal to leave Cuba. If Cuba finds you trying to leave, they're going to take you back. So then you get out to sea, limited food, limited water, crazy stories you hear from families whose family members have done this, eating the seagulls that land on their boat, crazy stuff. And then you get to the very end, and then you try to get on land. The most famous of these cases was Elian Gonzalez. That was a mother who took her child on one of these refugee escape trips. The mother drowns, the child gets on land, and then the father of Elian, who is still in Cuba, they say, no, we want the boy back. Big controversy. Clinton gives him back. The Americans have to storm into this house and grab Elian. Elian goes back to Cuba, and I'm sure he's doing great now. But those stories are core to kind of my identity about foreign policy. I understand how big of a thing this is. And I'm telling you, Marco Rubio isn't getting this close without flipping Havana. The view of the people that Marco Rubio grew up around, which are the people that I grew up around, is that there has been a perversion of justice in the Caribbean since the 1950s. Okay? That every day that goes by is a day that should not have existed. We talked a lot about Netanyahu after October 7th. You had a lot of things begin to tilt his way. A lot of things that all of a sudden, October 7th happens, very brutal. There's more of a push for him to not only take out Hamas in Gaza, but also Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then Syria falls. Okay, well, if Syria falls, then now the gates are open to attack Iran. I have made reference to that on this show before, that Rubio might look at this as a Goldilocks zone for change to come to Central, South America, and the Caribbean. And the crown jewel for Marco Rubio is Cuba. So I'm telling you now, listen to me now, believe me later on. I don't think a military and a State Department that believes Maduro is worth snatching out of Caracas also doesn't think that the clock is ticking loudly for the regime in Cuba. All right, let's move into the talking heads here. Tom Cotton, CNN, Dana Bash. Hey, do you think that this regime that we've left there is going to be friendly to the U.S.?
You mentioned that you hope that the former vice president, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is somebody who will work with the United States. She also has been a part of his inner circle. She also happens to be the oil minister in Venezuela. So is that part of what's going on here, that the administration is trying to install somebody who will be friendly to the United States with regard to oil?
Well, I don't think that we can count on Delcy Rodriguez to be friendly to the United States until she proves it. I mean, there are examples, recent examples, of anti-American leaders around the world turning over a new leaf. You had Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2003. You had Ahmed al-Shara, the current leader of Syria. But they made concrete concessions that benefited the United States, where they had a long history of turning a new page and moving in our direction. Delcy Rodriguez and other sanctioned and indicted ministers in Venezuela were in league with Maduro until yesterday. So I don't think we can count on them to be pro-American at all. I hope they turn over a new page.
Let me also just give you a little window into stuff that I have heard from Congress. You know, a lot of unease from Republicans. Remember, there have been hardcore MAGA loyalists who were not happy that they were not getting enough briefing on the missiles into the drug boats. And they didn't want a lot. They wanted someone in a uniform to come into a room and say, here are the tail number, or here's the number on the boat. We tracked them here and here and here. We've, blah, 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 blah. This is what we saw. This is what we know. Everything else is classified. That's all they wanted. They wanted someone to do that. Administration didn't do it. Nobody got a heads up on this until it was done. Is there going to be a push going forward? I've heard some prickly pears on the right. In private. Will it boil up to the surface? I don't know. This was so quick. This was so fast. One more Tom Cotton clip. There was a conversation about a planned second military attack that Trump said they still could do, but they're not thinking about it right now. What was it?
The president said Saturday that a second wave military attack had been planned. It wasn't necessary, but it could still be carried out. What would necessitate it, and what would you support?
Well, what I took the president to mean is that what we just did with Nicolas Maduro could be done again to other Venezuelan leaders. Several of them are indicted in U.S. courts. They're sanctioned by the United States and Canada and European Union and other nations. And if they continue down the path that Maduro took the nation of Venezuela, then we could conduct the same kind of operation as them. I took that as the president urging them to change their ways or face the same consequences.
All right, let's get into the Democratic perspective. Chuck Schumer. Oh, boy, talk about leaders past their prime. Chuck Schumer on ABC's This Week saying this whole thing is illegal. You need to come to Congress for stuff like this.
Senator, thank you for joining us this morning. Let me just start out. Do you think it's a good thing that Maduro has been removed from office?
Look, Maduro is a horrible, horrible person. But you don't treat lawlessness with other lawlessness. And that's what's happened here. The American people this morning, George, are scratching their heads in wonderment and in fear of what the president has proposed. The United States will run Venezuela. We have learned through the years when America tries to do regime change and nation building in this way, the American people pay the price in both blood and in dollars.
You heard Secretary Rubio there. He says the United States has the authority to do what they're doing.
They do not. They do not.
Why not?
He couldn't even answer your question. There is no authority to go. They did not just do ships off the water. They went inside Venezuela, bombed civilian as well as military places. And it's a violation of the law to do what they did without getting the authorization of Congress.
Oh, by the way, when you hear those Justin Robert Youngs on the podcast flapping their gums, this is more like Manuel Noriega than it is Iraq. Representative Jim Himes, Democrat, says, by the way, notable exceptions to the Manuel Noriega thing. Chief among them, the Bush administration talked to Congress.
The administration is arguing that what they did is legal, and that the snatch and grab operation of taking an indicted criminal, Nicolas Maduro, to the United States through military force has precedent. And they point back to what happened in the late 80s with Noriega in Panama. What's your challenge to that?
Yeah, well, first, it's clearly illegal under international law, right? No, full stop, UN Charter, no question there. Now, you may not care about international law, but if you don't care about international law, remember you're going to be making an appeal to international law to try to get restitution for the seizure of Chevron's oil stuff. So maybe you want to rethink how much disdain you show for international law. Clearly not legal under the Constitution, because though presidents of both parties have argued against this, the Constitution is really pretty clear that the representatives of the people get to be consulted and ultimately approve military activity. That has not happened here at all. And so, again, there's nothing legal about this. And more to the point, again, under the international law point, think of what Russia and China just learned. Russia and China just learned that all you need to do if you want to go into Estonia is to say that the leader of Estonia is a bad person. You don't even need to make a particularly good case. Look, there's no national security expert saying that Venezuela was a mortal threat to the United States 3 weeks ago. So what China and Russia just learned is that the beacon of liberty and rule of law in the world has now green-lighted snatch and grab operations in Estonia, in Taiwan, wherever Xi and Putin decide they want to go next.
So I take your point on the precedent there. Do you think that China or Russia would have the ability to carry out that kind of lightning operation the United States did?
Well, no, but that doesn't mean, well, China, yes. China very soon, and, you know, their leader has said, we will develop this capability. We know that their intent is to do precisely this in Taiwan. Russia's a more complicated case. It's, you know, Russia loses 10,000 people to get, 3 acres of land in eastern Ukraine. But that may not be true 5 years from now. And by the way, back to the Noriega case, because you do ask a good question there. Panama is a terrible precedent. Why do I say that? Because when we went into Panama, the Panamanian Congress had declared war on the United States of America, right? They had killed a United States Marine and wounded 2 others, and the Congress had been consultant. The Congress in the Noriega mission had authorized regime change. So it's a terrible precedent that the administration is using to say that this is legal.
Yeah, as we understand it, because we looked this up, Noriega claimed head of state immunity, and the court said that immunity was meant to protect official state functions and private profiting off the drug trade. Basically, the courts ruled on his actions as a leader and not on the legality of the snatch and grab operation itself.
And finally, one more Democratic clip. Chris Murphy, somebody who would love Chuck Schumer's job, saying that here's the only brand that matters. Trump is a liar. He lied about being anti-interventionalist. He lied about affordability. And he is lying to both Congress and the American people right now.
I do want to ask about a briefing that the Secretary of State and Defense held with senators. You were there.
Yep.
Last month about Venezuela. Can you talk about what they said and whether or not that actually bore out?
Well, I can certainly tell you the message that they sent was that this wasn't about regime change. I mean, they came to Congress and they literally lied to our face. They said, this is just a counter-narcotics operation. This is about trying to interrupt the drug flow to the United States. Right around that same time, the White House Chief of Staff said publicly, if we ever had boots on the ground in Venezuela, of course we would have to come to Congress. Listen, there's no way to trust this administration. They aren't being straight with the American people. There isn't even a briefing scheduled for Congress next week to explain A, what happened, and B, what the plan is moving forward. But yes, I think everybody in that briefing heard the administration say, this is just a targeted counter-narcotics operation. This has nothing to do with regime change. They knew they weren't telling the truth in that room.
So where are we? I think My favorite meme after all this happened was a still frame from the Star Wars film Return of the Jedi, where in that movie, Emperor Palpatine tells Luke Skywalker that I'm afraid the Death Star is quite operational because the rebels believe it's not fully built yet. And in this memeified version, it's I'm afraid that the Monroe Doctrine is quite operational. What is the Monroe Doctrine? Well, the Monroe Doctrine essentially says that the U.S. runs our hemisphere. If you are in North America, Central America, South America, we're all going to get along. And by get along, what we says goes. So be careful if you're going too far afoul of the good old US of A. Now, that is something that has attrited over the years. You know, World War II put our eyes toward Europe. We have since then gotten into wars in Korea, several spots throughout the South Pacific, and then eventually the Middle East. Now, sure, every once in a while, there are things that happen in our hemisphere that we get involved in, but a lot of that has been, CIA stuff, and not the same kind of military might the same way that we have in Asia and the Middle East. There is a statement, or the strategic statement that was put out by the Trump administration a couple weeks ago. Now, it made a lot of headlines in Europe because it essentially said that, look, Europe's business is going to increasingly be Europe's business. We're turning our eyes more toward our own hemisphere. And the Europeans took that as like, oh my God, you're abandoning us. The entire world order that was built after World War II is dead, blah, blah, blah. Less was focused on us saying where we're going to keep our eyes. I believe that we have backed up that statement. A million steps from here, things could go very right, things could go very wrong. I will say that the political liability here is such. There will be no immediate, dramatic gas price change, in my opinion. We're not going to see 50-cent gas or something like that, something crazy. I don't think. So I don't believe that's the motivation here, that Donald Trump would win over the hearts and minds of the average American people by crazy low gas. Gas is pretty low right now. Here in Central Texas, it's like $2.30 for the cheap stuff, which is what I buy. That's pretty good. Anything under 3, I think, is good. Anything under 2 is insane. But I don't think that that's going to happen. The U.S. domestically needs to begin to understand that things are going better for them, because I don't think they're going to be placated by the idea that there is muscular foreign policy. Is it better for the world if Nicolas Maduro, who was not recognized as a legitimate leader by the U.S., by the EU, by many international organizations, who was well known to be a thug, who was well known to have suppressed not 1 but 2 elections, is it better that that man is gone? Unless you were cashing in from his grift, I don't know if anyone can say that it would be better if he were still there. Now, you can wish that the tin pot dictator fairy kind of just raptured him out of Caracas And I think we could all say, yeah, it would be better if that happened. But this is, the road to hell, paved with good intentions. Will it matter if somebody worse comes into Venezuela? That is the story yet to be told, and we're going to cover every second of it. And that'll wrap it up for us today. Politics, written and hosted by me, Justin Robert Young, for Dog and Pony Show Audio in Austin, Texas. Again, this is normally a bonus episode. We're going to put it out for everybody because big news. You deserve to know. We'll be back on Wednesday's episode. We might release that a little bit earlier. We're going to talk about Iran, because we have a special guest. There's unrest there. Is Venezuela the only regime to be changing? I don't know. Marco Rubio might have to update his LinkedIn to add President of Venezuela and Shah of Iran. The way that guy adds jobs. That's Wednesday. Till then, this is your old pal Justin Robert Young saying politics has three names.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.
Dog and Pony Show Audio.